Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome to another session here at the 26th World Economic Forum on Africa. Thank you for joining us, whether you're in this room or watching the live stream online. I'm Nancy Kachungira, and it's a pleasure to be moderating this discussion this afternoon. We're about to have a conversation on the future of production, as we ask the question of how leaders are transforming Africa's production and manufacturing agenda. Now, if you'll just take a moment and think about some of the products you interacted with this morning or this afternoon, whether it was a car or a coffee machine, maybe the clothes you're wearing or your mobile phone. How many of those have a label or a tag that says they were made in Africa? Perhaps not many. It's a continent of 1 billion people, but Africa commands a meager 1.5% share of global manufacturing output. Now, this is something that leaders have been working to change with some success, but there are still challenges. And more than ever, the context in which they're trying to do this is changing too. From genetic engineering to artificial intelligence, 3D printing, new technologies are poised to transform the global manufacturing and production systems in a way that we've never seen before. So the question is, what does this mean for Africa? And how can Africa find its place in the new realities of the fourth industrial revolution? Rising inequality, surging unemployment, these are things that people look at and say it's hard to see how Africa will benefit, while others see the continent as the ultimate leapfrog economy and say that there are opportunities that technology will provide. Well, today we want to go beyond predictions of doom on one hand or promise on the other, and look at the agency that people and governments and businesses and individuals have over these seemingly exogenous forces. So today we're going to ask the question, what are those approaches, what are those capabilities that Africa needs to make its production systems more effective, more efficient, more inclusive as well? And I have a panel up here with me that is more than up to this task. I'll be introducing them in just a moment, but not before I remind you that you are an important part of this discussion today, and I'd like you to take part. You can actually send in your questions, your opinions on Twitter. We're using a hashtag Made in Africa for this discussion, and it will be great to hear from you. Hopefully I can incorporate some of those in the discussion. And while you're on Twitter, you might want to look up and follow our panelists today. To my immediate left is Geoffrey Kena. He's the Chief Executive Officer at the IDC, the Industrial Development Corporation of South Africa. For more than 70 years, the IDC has been instrumental in implementing South Africa's industrial policy, establishing and supporting some of the country's key manufacturing industries, including the petrochemicals and minerals beneficiation industries, as well as fabricated metals, agro-industries, clothing, and textiles. Thank you very much for coming today. We also have Ali Angula, who is the co-founder and managing director of Leap Holdings Namibia. The Leap group of companies has operating businesses in private label garment manufacturing, horticulture, and branded garment retailing sectors. And it was in 2014 that Leap Manufacturing Namibia was set up to add value to the goods that their agro-processing side of the company produces. Thank you very much for joining us today. And lastly, we have Johan Auric. He is the Global Managing Partner and Chairman of the Board, A.T. Kearney. Mr. Auric has more than 25 years of consulting experience in industry, spanning a wide variety of strategic issues for leading consumer goods and retail clients. He previously served as the head of Europe, Middle East, and Africa region at A.T. Kearney. And very exciting, A.T. Kearney just launched a multi-year effort in partnership with the Forum on the future of production systems. So that's something we'll be excited to see the results of. But let's just jump into our discussion with that fundamental question that people have been grappling with. What is the right approach for Africa to take in light of all these developments going on with technology? It seems like we have so far to go, we can't start where everybody else has started. I'll start with you, Geoffrey, just in terms of these systems. Is labor-intensive production, the way that we should go? Or should we be looking more at advanced technological systems?
Thanks, Nancy. I think we should look at both, because one part is the level of unemployment is still relatively high. But as we advance, I think we should be looking at embracing innovation. In fact, I would like to believe that there's a lot that is happening, but then the issue is that's not enough. And if I look at the IDC, where what we're doing, there's a number of, you said made in Africa, there's a number of made in Africa things that we do. But then the issue is how quickly can we do this so that we catch up to some of those. Indeed, I'm sure we'll come back to that. They might have an impact on the issues of labor. But I will give examples, I think, as when we come in. But I think if we were to only look at innovation at exclusion of looking at labor intensive, chances are we'll be excluding a lot of other people. And I don't think that will be sustainable. So the trick is then how do we indeed strike that balance, embrace innovation, bring in new technologies, but at the same time then seeing how then do we ensure that the level of unemployment is not at levels which is unacceptable.
Ms. Agula, you seem to agree with this approach?
I do. I think it's really one of those situations where it needs to be a multifaceted approach in terms of how it is being tackled, because we mustn't forget that we've got unemployment rates sitting near 30% in most of our African economies, and a lot of that would come with the fact that it's unskilled labor. So we need to be just making sure that we're not leaving people behind with regards to advancement in technology. So it's going to be multifaceted.
Mr. Aurik, we're hearing that we need to have the two approaches, but a lot of people have spoken about the leapfrogging that Africa can take advantage of. We've heard M-Pesa 1 million times as an example of the kind of movement that we can make. Is that the approach that we should be taking?
I think it should be certainly one of the strategies to seriously consider. The example that everyone gives when the word leapfrogging is mentioned is mobile. And for instance, the impact on banking. That's the one that the whole world, believe me, not only in Africa, but that the whole world writes about, and I think rightly so. It has been phenomenal. However, that mobile technology has not been fully used yet to leapfrog information exchange to the fullest extent. So there's a lot more to be done. But it's certainly one of the things that I would consider, and it's also really important to do so. But we'll come back on that.
So it's one of the things, but
Yes.
what are some of the other things that need to be considered? And perhaps what are the most important and pertinent ones?
There's no silver bullet here, so you will not get that from me, because there simply is not. There are several factors that play a role, and if you think about production, there are different factor costs, as the economic term is, that apply a role. You mentioned labor, and that's certainly a big one. There's ample labor, and as we know, the population will double over the next 20, 30 years in Africa, so there will be even more. The issue is that productivity is really low. It's even lower on average than the cost of labor, and that's the issue. So labor is certainly one of the factors, but there's many more. There's raw material, and there Africa has an enormous advantage that is, I think, in many ways still untapped. The closeness and the availability of raw materials. And then the third biggest one is the closeness of markets. In a continent where the population will double from 1.5 billion to 2.5 billion in 2050, that creates, certainly with rising GDP growth, an enormous market of consumers. And that's the other third really big factor that plays a role. And then I've not even talked about technology. So you see there are different factors that play a role that all need to be considered and require policy attention and require attention from companies in order to improve that.
I'll come to you, Geoffrey, because the IDC actually does provide funding up to R1 billion for different businesses and to push the manufacturing and production agenda. What factors are you looking at when you're choosing which businesses to invest in and which you think will bring you the most returns?
What we look at is sustainability. I think it's important because we are in this for a long haul. So it depends also in sectors in which we come in. So if you look on infrastructure, that's a long-term view. So it is important that sustainability is there. One of the other issues that we look at is the ability of those projects, directly or indirectly, to be able to create employment. That will come back to this issue of saying, let's look at this innovation without the exclusion of that. So those will be the key. Naturally, you would want entrepreneurs who would want to take the risk, who would want to be there in the long haul, because most of these businesses are driven by entrepreneurs, or if it's existing businesses. So we look at a number of factors. I want to come to the issue of labor. When we're looking at employment, with this innovation that we have to embrace, I think it is important then we look at how do we reskill, or even in some instances upskill, because I think that's one of the initiatives that we could look at in ensuring that indeed this level of unemployment is addressed. Because you don't want to be going way ahead and leaving the rest of the population, because then that ability to embrace them will be lost. But one of the issues that we're focusing on largely is on infrastructure, and largely energy as well, because we know there's different countries at different levels in terms of energy, and if you're going to large industries, you need a lot of energy, and at the back of that, what we've seen is renewable energy. I think that South Africa has done well, and I think there's an opportunity for the rest of the continent to can also go that way.
So in terms of bringing manufacturing to Africa and utilizing this amazing demographic that we have, China is looking for the next China. That's what some commentators have said, as they move from a labor to a capital-intensive economy. 85 million jobs could be moving from China. Is there an opportunity there for Africa? I'll ask you this first, Ms. Angula, because you're involved in manufacturing. What is the opportunity that this shift in China provides for Africa?
So the opportunity comes from the fact that we actually have got products that we need to provide to ourselves as consumers on this continent. And we mustn't forget that we've got quite a huge number in terms of population. And those people, us ourselves, are looking for products to consume. So there in it lies the immense opportunities. And a lot of the decisions in terms of manufacturing also comes down to where are you actually providing your products. You know, the quickest route to the market. And we've got a big market, we've got a big demand to fill in terms of products that need to be consumed every day on this continent. So there are immense opportunities in manufacturing.
And when you look at those markets, do they have the capacity to sustain these efforts, or are you looking at markets outside of Africa? What is the scope that you're looking at?
If we look at the fact that there isn't a lot of intertrade happening on the continent, I think we're sitting somewhere in the region of about 14%. So the opportunities are certainly amongst ourselves on the continent, and then as well as exporting. So we are a commodity-led export continent, and the opportunities will continue in terms of value-added products to be able to export those. But I think we mustn't forget that we've got a big market on the continent itself.
So what's holding us back?
There is talent gaps that need to be filled. So I'll use my business as an example. So you said, you know, if we think of the products that we are consuming and wearing today, you don't find a lot of made in Africa products. So, for instance, I'm wearing everything that we've manufactured. But it's the talent gap that you need to fill. So when you go from product design into product development, you can't, for instance, just take an architect needs to have that skill to be able to design something, and that skill we need to develop. So those are the gaps that we are really finding. It's filling the gaps in talent, because we haven't been manufacturing for a really long time.
And I'll go to you, Mr. Aurik. In terms of filling those gaps, and we've talked a lot about upskilling, but what are the practical ways in which we go about doing that?
Yeah. First of all, I would like to confirm what you said, which is really important. The biggest opportunity for Africa, for African countries and for businesses operating in Africa is Africa. Because here is where the biggest population growth will take place of any other place in the world. Don't ever forget that. And the thing to focus on is to avoid companies from outside Africa selling manufactured goods here that could be done by African companies. That's the opportunity at hand. We see four big things that need to be improved dramatically, I would even add. Not a little bit, but dramatically. Because maybe one statistic that's important to keep in mind, if you look at the percentage of GDP that manufacturing represents. In China, you mentioned that it's 30% right now. 30% of the GDP is manufactured goods. If you, I'll pick a few African countries. Nigeria is 9%, Kenya is 12%, Zambia is 8%. So these are very low numbers. So where we need to go, this is really a big leap forward. I want to underline the magnitude of that. So 4, one is upskilling and training, particularly vocational training. So not so much university, but particularly vocational. Second is the whole area of open trade regulation. Africa does not exploit its scale. It's another way of saying the same thing. 3 is everything having to do with transport, with utilities, with information systems that simply are not up to scratch, to put it in simple English. That's 3. And 4 is indeed innovation, and it doesn't have to be the most advanced innovation. You can start at a very modest pace, and already the impact can be huge there. Now, it's easy to say those 4 things. It's very, very hard to do. This will take a long time. This is a matter not of months or years, but of decades.
But does Africa have that time? Can we afford to grow at the same rate that other countries have grown? Or do we have to leapfrog in order just to get where others are? Otherwise, we'll be left behind forever.
Of course, no one is going to stop you from leapfrogging. And if you can in certain areas, you absolutely should. The question is, solving these problems is like solving a very complex system. Let's not underestimate the magnitude. Why we're sitting here talking about it. This is very hard to solve. My favorite expression is, pardon me, a Latin expression, which is festina lente. So it's sort of like hurry slowly. What I mean with that is that all these changes, every country in the world faces these changes. It's very hard to do, not only for Africa, but for everyone in the world. And so there is time. Not everything changes from one day to another. And system change usually is much slower than most people think. But it doesn't mean that you should not push as hard as you can and treat it with the utmost urgency. So it's a bit of a philosophical answer, perhaps, but I think correct.
All right. Do you want to get a little less philosophical with that?
I think you are right, Nancy. We need to leapfrog because innovation by its nature will disrupt. So if we're going to go at the same pace, I think we'll be left behind. We'll have those technologies just overtaking us. Now, maybe, as I said right at the beginning, there are certain things that are happening. For an example, there's a lot of work that is being done on telemedicine, for an example, because then you're ensuring that you're having access, people who are ordinarily won't have that access can be able to do that. So there's been a research which is driven by South Africans, although they go out and they interact with others, what they do in Asia and all of that. So there's that. On Monday, I went to a plant which was looking at, in fact, which has been started to recycle bottles. I mean, we drink that water bottle that you have here. Most of it, of the inputs, are imported. So what we're saying is, how can we use that? Not only is it going to tick the box for environment, tick the box for ensuring that employment is created, but what it will also do is that those bottles which are being consumed in Africa actually be used. So there's that as well. So you're right, we need to leapfrog. We can't go at a slow pace. What we have not done well, I think, as Africans, is to implement. We've spoken a lot about infrastructure because we need that. I mean, this intertrade, which needs to happen. The infrastructure needs to be there. So we've spoken about it. We know there needs to be more investment in energy. We know there needs to be more investment on roads because as much as we talk about processing, but then how do you get those products that are in the farms that needs to be processed? So I think for us, really, to be able to ensure that we leap from, let's just implement what we know. I mean, if you go on the 2030 vision, which it's in the AU, which is most of the African presidents have embraced, let's just implement it so that we can indeed be able to leapfrog.
Okay. And if I come to you, Ali, you've got 3 clothing stores already. You've got another one opening up in August. What's your experience been as a manufacturer within the African context? What are the major challenges? What are the things that are keeping us from leapfrogging or upskilling?
So for us, it's been filling the links within the supply chain, and we've got a lot of missing links. So we're looking at, for instance, where are we sourcing our raw materials? We are a continent that grows cotton. but we're still growing cotton using seeds from quite a while back, which brings me back to our agricultural business. We are missing links in terms of where, for instance, I'll take a very simple example, printing labels, care labels for our clothes. All of those things we are actually importing into our country specifically, but we likely importing in from our neighboring country, South Africa. So there's a lot of links within the supply chain that as a manufacturer, you have to either fill those links yourself or you pay double the price to fill those links. And then coming back to skills, that we need to build that skill from the beginning. And in some of our manufacturing industries that we're going into, it is industries that we are creating from scratch. It's not where you're coming in and that industry already exists and you can source the skills from your local pool of talent. So it's building that skill. So as an entity, you are paying double the price to basically get into manufacturing. So those are some of the challenges. Access to reliable energy. So we've set up our manufacturing plant in a little village, and we really set up our company to impact 1 million lives. And we wanted to go into areas where people would appreciate the jobs that we are creating from manufacturing. And we had a conversation with the local village council around power and access to water. And we were informed that there is electricity and there is water. And we've just found out now, we've just gone through our first rainy season, and for 3 weeks we had no power. And because there wasn't any manufacturing activity happening in this village, they had gone for years and years knowing that when the rainy season comes, there's not going to be any power for 3 weeks. Unfortunately, for a manufacturing entity, you can't be out of production for 3 weeks. So it's really, filling the links in with regards to supply chain. It's upskilling your staff and paying for that cost to upskill your staff. It is making sure that you've got access to raw material and making sure that it is in an area where it is easily accessible, and then access to infrastructure.
Right. I'm going to come to you, Johan, to just build on that, especially that point about supply chains and value chains, and where does Africa fit in? As Ali mentioned, importantly, only 12% of Africa's imported intermediates are sourced from the region.
Yeah.
There's an missed opportunity there, isn't there?
Yeah, there's an enormously missed, it's a pity. One thing is really important to stress at this point is that when people think about production or about manufacturing, they see a plant. That's the image that they have in their mind. And that's the wrong image, because that's actually often the least important part of what you're talking about. We're talking about systems here, value chain systems. It's about sourcing the raw materials, all the goods, it's distribution, it's innovation. There are many different parts to that, and these are very, very complex systems. And if one part of the chain does not work well or is not optimal, the final product simply will not be bought by the final customer, or often doesn't even reach the final customer. Yeah. So these are very complex systems, and that's why it's so hard to do, because these systems in Europe and in North America, they had 200 years or even longer to grow these systems over time, slowly. Africa needs to run faster. We all know that. We agree on that. And it's very hard to do. Now, it can be done. Look at China. China did it reasonably fast, we would agree. But China is one gigantic country and run in a very hierarchical way. And not all Africa is run that way. Which is maybe a good thing too, you would argue. And so these complex systems are very hard to develop over time, and it's an incredibly important thing to keep in mind. That's why there's not one factor that does it. That's why there are no silver bullets. That's why government and companies and NGOs need to work together. It's a multi-stakeholder game to solve a very complex system issue. That's the easiest way to think about this. And that's why it will take time also. It will not be quick, by definition. That does not mean that the urgency should not be high. That's super important, but it will take time.
I'm sure it's not all doom and gloom, though. There must be some examples of things that have been done, of interventions that are working. Please, we need to hear about some of those. Let's go to you, John.
I like when you said made in Africa. We have in South Africa something called Lodox. It's an X-ray machine, a low dosage X-ray machine. It's developed in South Africa, so it's in Africa. that came from in the diamond mines when people were being x-rayed. So in an emergency, in a trauma situation, when you come in, within 13 seconds, it will give you a full body scan. So it will give you, so that then when the doctors have to do a procedure, they know exactly where you have to do. And I think that we've seen that uptake not only in South Africa, and we've seen that being exported as well. So there are some examples. I mean, I can talk about there's a breast cancer system which is being developed now, where it will assist even in tissues which are dense, it can be able to detect that, so that then intervention is much easier. So, but I want to come back to the speed. What we need to do, we should not only just look at the traditional ways of doing it, because innovation by its nature should allow us, in instances where there's no infrastructure, we've seen it with mobile telephones, then how do we use that? Because in the past, we had to rely on laying the cables and all of that, but we've seen the mobile telephony, I mean, really changing that. Now fiber is actually following. So we need to think a little bit different, and even in the processing, because you can't only just look at the previous ways of doing that. We have to really start thinking out of the box. And I think there's a number of instances which is happening, but we just need to increase that.
Now, that's an important point about innovation and thinking outside of the box, especially as we think about the context of the fourth industrial revolution. But I'd like you to just look at this quote that's going to come on the screen just now. And I did sort of poll people on social media and speak to a couple of local economists. And this seemed to be the summary of what people are thinking. The largest beneficiaries of innovation are the creators. Africa is not driving the fourth industrial revolution and therefore will not benefit. It's a dim view, but I don't think it's entirely true. And it can't be entirely true, otherwise we wouldn't be here trying to look at ways that we can change this. So what would you say to someone who completely believes that quote, that statement, that Africa is not creating, it's not driving the agenda, and therefore it will always be following, copying, and emulating what others are doing? I'll start at the end, and I'd like to hear from each of you on that.
Well, you accused me just now of being doom and gloom,
It was not an
Nancy.
accusation.
So let me, which I'm not at all, I'm an optimist, I can assure you. And I am, and we are incredibly optimistic on the prospects of Africa over the long term. But really, because what are the opportunities? You have this fantastic growth prospect. There's no single continent that has so much population growth, which is the biggest driver of wealth, by the way. There's no second even close. There's no continent that has that. There's hardly a continent with more raw materials and more opportunity for growth. If only all the agricultural production gets translated into food manufacturing and food processing. Just see what's right now taking place and see what's possible. But it's a gigantic opportunity. And I believe, and we believe, and if you look at economics, innovation and growth is usually driven by the opportunity, not so much by because I believe that people in Africa are as creative as in Silicon Valley or in China or Japan or what have you. I don't believe there's a fundamental difference. The difference is the ease of work, and the difference is the size of the opportunity. That's what usually drives it. And I have seen an incredible amount of creativity in Africa, so I would not subscribe to this statement at all.
I don't either. I'm very, very optimistic about this continent. Africa is a very vibrant continent, and I believe that the opportunities are on this continent. This is the last frontier. It is just, we need to be a little bit more deliberate about our planning. We need to be a little bit more deliberate in terms of our implementation.
How do we do that?
I think it comes down to saying, what is it exactly that we want? And once we've clarified, I think we've got a lot of things that we want to achieve, and perhaps we try and really split ourselves because there are so many challenges that we need to address. But I think it's focusing on one or two and saying, if we want to bring everybody into the net, we want to create jobs, what are those areas that we're going to be focusing on to be able to do that? And they've been a lot of homegrown solutions. I mean, yes, we've spoken about M-Pesa, but if we look at what's happening in the agricultural space, you've got a lot of people, young people, getting into agriculture and thinking agriculture is very sexy all of a sudden. And we are seeing a lot of drone technology being used to improve yields in terms of the fields. So I think it's just being about deliberate and not splitting ourselves into too many areas of what our focus areas needs to be, and then following through in terms of implementation. And we've seen that in countries. If we take Rwanda, for instance, Rwanda is very deliberate. So if we follow the examples of where we've seen things working and be deliberate and implement, I think we will get there. And there needs to be a sense of urgency. And I think we're waking up to that we need to get moving now.
Jeffrey, can Africa lead the fourth industrial revolution?
Well, as Johan said and Ali said, I mean, this is, if you look in the whole world, the fastest place that is growing is the continent. So I think that's where the opportunities are. I mean, maybe with China having slowed down, when we were comfortable with exporting our resources, maybe it's a good wake-up call. Because now we have to ensure that we grow in spite of us not exporting those. So that sort of forces. I think what we should increase is the level of collaboration. I think Ali did say the intertrade is very low. And if each country looks at what is imported outside of the continent, and we say which country can do that we can increase. So I don't subscribe to that code. I think if I did, then we wouldn't, as IDC, seeing the level of activity that we're seeing. I mean, outside of South Africa, almost 12% of activity is in the rest of the continent, because that's where we see growth, and we're looking at increasing that.
Thank you. I'll be coming to the audience for questions in just a moment, so do prepare your question if you have one. But just before we get to that, I'd like us to talk about the monster, which is inequality, where we seem to be creating rich economies of poor populations. What can we do to make sure that any growth that we have in production and manufacturing systems are in fact inclusive? I'll start with you, Ali.
I think we need to just be aware that we don't leave people behind. So when we're talking about innovation and we're talking about technology, we need to be aware that we've got people that, some people have been left out of the education system deliberately in terms of the history that a lot of our countries on the continent have. And we need to be making sure that we are aware that we've got a population that is not skilled. And therefore, as we are going about and shaping the industries that our countries are going to be focusing on, making sure that we're pulling those people into the economy. So for instance, I'll use that maybe as an example. So we used to be, our people used to be largely employed in agriculture. We're now moving to where there's a lot of services that are now being provided, and a lot of it is within the technological space. And people aren't trained. We've got a lot of people that don't know how to use computers. Yes, we've got movement and a lot of people that have adopted mobile, but where the jobs are actually moving to, they are moving towards services and being, knowing technology, and our people don't have that skill. So it's knowing that we've got that set within our society and bringing those people with in terms of identifying what are those jobs that do not require that type of skill, and making sure that we've got sectors within our economies that cater for that, or else we're going to be creating two economies. And we need to be moving within a society where we're bringing people together within our different economies.
So, Johan, how do we merge a world where jobs are disappearing to robots and more technology with a world that desperately needs a population that is employed? How a context where we have one of the fastest growing economies like Mozambique, with more than 20% of its population unemployed. How do we bridge those two worlds?
That's indeed one of the biggest challenges there is over the long run. Solving this issue is, like I said before, a multi-stakeholder issue. You can only do that with governments and NGOs and companies and any stakeholder we can imagine working together towards this. That's, in the long run, the only way to do that. It's as important what you do versus what you also do not do. What is really important is that barriers of trade are kept as low as possible. It's really important because that generates wealth, certainly within Africa, because that's the only way to profit from the scale that Africa that Africa has inherently, and still too often that is not the case. What is important is that governments particularly focus on the right policies to facilitate economic growth and to make sure that jobs are created. And that includes the ones that we have been discussing: vocational training, transport and infrastructure, innovation, etc., etc. Those are the ways to create long-term growth. So-called phantom jobs, in the end, don't last very long, as we all know. We know countries where that took place. The importance is to create real jobs, sustainable work. Yes, it's true that technology, particularly if it's introduced very quickly, has often a negative effect on employment. You see that. You see that in many places around the world. For instance, online retail is replacing retail jobs. It's true. But over the long run, they tend to be replaced by other types of work. If I see the opportunity in Africa, just doing a little bit more of, for instance, food manufacturing to get this abundance of agriculture, to get more value added out of that, so to speak. The same with minerals. Just a little bit more will already generate so much more employment. And I think that is where the government and also businesses need to focus on.
Thank you for that. If you want to chip in, you can do that, and we'll go to a question from the audience right after that.
Well, I think they've covered the issues. Really, I want to emphasize education. I think the investment in education, so that you ensure in that process you reskill, because as you're right,
But
as you
does the type of education also matter?
Absolutely, absolutely. If the governments invest in studying new industries, then the education must talk to that. So you might have some of the people, as a result of these innovations that come in, which will find themselves displaced. Then there's an opportunity for them to reskill some of those. That's why I'm saying education holistically, and particularly vocational education.
Okay. Is there a question from the audience? We have one over there. Can we have a microphone at the front here? Thank you. As we get that question, kindly tell us your name and your
Hello,
question.
my name is Omnia. I'm a global shaper from Tripoli Hub, Libya. This is a very interesting discussion, talking about Made in Africa and all the opportunities out there, the challenges that Africa faces. And I'm wondering, now we talked about the challenges in stable countries. How about unstable countries, security-wise? Is it only a challenge that would withdraw investors from investing and looking at these countries, or there might be also an opportunity there for investors and for the community? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Who would like to take this one?
Well, there's a certain order in things. Everyone has, I'm sure, the famous Maslow pyramid. Maybe you have seen that, which is an American scientist who developed it. First of all, you need to have food and security before you can even think about jobs and even about manufacturing jobs. There's a certain order in things. So there needs to be the minimum stability in a country. Look at the country where we're in here. All the progress over the last years was possible because of stability. That's the first one. Second one, you need food. Without that, nothing else is possible. So there's a certain order in things. And in very unstable places in the world, it's very hard to set up very complex manufacturing systems, as we talked about that. So there's a certain order in things. And I think the chances of that developing and being successful in the long run in stable countries, and regrettably there are many, as we all know, who read the newspaper, I think the chances are slim.
You'd like to respond?
Yes,
Go ahead.
maybe if I can. I think the observation is very true. Countries need to be stable so that it becomes easier for investors. For me, that's where the role of the AU should come in. I know it's very active, and I think it can continue to be active to ensure that it helps bring stability in the continent, so that then investments, because some of these investments are long-term in their nature, and people need to be comfortable to ensure that when they put in a mine or where they put in an agricultural project, it will be able to be sustainable.
And that's an important contribution as well. Let's go to the gentleman over there, and then we'll take one from Twitter as well.
Thank you very much. Bishop Serafi represented the faith communities. I was in Nairobi and then in Johannesburg and now in Zimbabwe. But I am involved in the negotiations on behalf of the faith communities on climate change and sustainable development. My question, I like to get the views of the speakers about the way they manage the available resources in Africa, the governments. For example, there are 20 countries now involved in war, in conflicts, or in civil war. And they spend a lot of money on military developments. And we know that the money which is going out from Africa is more than the money is coming. And Africa is the #1 in poverty, a violation of human rights, and climate change disasters. In Zimbabwe now, or in Malawi, there is a stage of an emergency. There is no food for the people. So what is the role of the Security Council of the United Nations to impose, for example, an embargo on military developments in order to use the available funds? Because if there is no safe environment, as Nelson Mandela mentioned many times, we cannot see any development. And then you mentioned the importance of training and of employment of people. In countries where they suffer of poverty today, not only in Africa, everywhere in the world, when the 5–10% of the population of our country control the 90% of the resources, and 90% they have access only to 10%. Of course, the unemployment is 80%.
Okay,
and
sir.
like in Egypt before the revolution.
Thank you, sir. I'm going to have to try to get an answer so that we can get to as many other questions as possible. But I will also add to that this comment on Twitter that says Mozambique and Vietnam have the same growth rates and have increased jobs by 160,000 and 2 million respectively. Why can't Africa create jobs? Ali, you're in the business of creating jobs. Perhaps you'd like to take that one.
Yeah, it's a difficult question. And I think it comes down to, I think that the want and the realization that we need to create jobs is certainly there. It is freeing up trade amongst ourselves to really realize the potential that this continent has, that I think we will be able to fill in the gaps. So if I need to deliver a product to somebody in Zambia and I see that I've got brilliant infrastructure in Namibia, then I'm going to be manufacturing there in Namibia and delivering that product in my neighboring country. And I think it comes down to, again, just implementation. I think we're very good at putting down policies, for instance. We're very good about talking through ideas, but it's the implementation that really holds us back as a continent. And I think it's really getting down to implementation.
Yes, Johan, do jump
Maybe
in.
to follow on that, both questions were, I think, very similar, at least in spirit, I think. We're talking about, as I said several times, very complex systems. That is what production is, really. These are systems. And to set it up, as you rightfully said, an investor needs to have stability for that. Otherwise, you do not make these long-term investments. Vietnam, you mentioned the country, since the last, 30, 40 years, of course went through a terrible Vietnam War, but ever since that has been very stable. Also had a government that was very central-led. Some people would call it a dictatorship, but let's call it very central-led. And increasingly had been doing very the right things in terms of investing for the long term. So stability and the right government making the right investments in training, in infrastructure, gradually getting better. That is the recipe. We've seen it in many other places. That creates long-term success. That's how countries like Korea were able to make incredible development over the last decades, which is a fantastic example, even better, I would argue, than Vietnam. You need long-term stability, otherwise it's very hard to see that these production systems develop over the long term.
Long-term stability, very crucial. And I'll go to this question on Twitter from Mustafa Maleki, and this will probably go to you, Jeffrey. To what extent do African policymakers get together with their counterparts in the South-South corridor to learn from their experiences?
Well, if I look at the 2030 plan, I'm encouraged that at least the African leaders know what is supposed to do. If you look at the policies in terms of increasing the level of manufacturing, I think this is one area, to increase the level of inter-regional trade. That's good. I will come back to the point I made. For me, is that then we need to implement a bit faster. So maybe that is why it is not as evident as it is. I've been in many forums where most of those African leaders who are in those forums know exactly what needs to be done. So, and I think the issue of ensuring that private sector is also brought in so that that real collaboration happens, then some of these things will be very obvious. They're not as obvious now is because the collaboration is not at the level where it should be, and the level of implementation is probably not at the pace where it should be.
We'll take another question from the audience. There's a gentleman over there. And as we get that question, I would like my panel to think about this word implementation. We've said it a lot, it's come up a lot. We need to go beyond that now and think, okay, we can't just say we need to implement. What is that tangible thing we're going to walk away with today that we can do to make what we're talking about a reality? Your question, sir.
Thank you very much. My name is George Appiah. I'm a global shaper from Kumasi Hub, Ghana. I am also a maker and innovator. When it comes to Africa, we don't really have the culture of doing it yourself, like making, where you try to build products to solve your own challenges. I want to find out that how can we, looking at the future of production in Africa, how can we inculcate this mindset of making or doing it yourself into the early stage of our education, so that right from the primary schools, they are given the skills or they're exposed to platforms that encourage making and doing it yourself right from there, so that by the time they leave maybe for higher education, they have that mentality and then they are oriented to solve problems and help come up with systems that we can increase production in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you for your question, sir. Culture, how do we make Africa's culture a culture of innovation? Ali, you look like you can answer that one.
Yeah. What we've experienced is exposure plays such a big role. We've had many people come through to our company to certainly come and see what it is that we're doing. And once you've had the conversation, it's a person would say to you, oh, but I didn't know it was so easy to make clothes. And all they've seen is they would have seen the item in the shop. Or I didn't know that it's so easy to dehydrate an onion product and get it onto the shelf. But once they've seen it, they themselves believe that it can be done. So exposure is very, very important. And it drives people to get inspired. It drives people to think, I can also do it. And we need to be showcasing a lot more in terms of the success stories on the continent when it comes to manufacturing. And that will encourage people to get into the different industries. But building that belief that you can actually do it. You've seen somebody else do it. It's not as complicated as we make it out to seem. Yes, there is a process. There is product design, there's product development, and then there is the retailing of that product, the manufacturing and the retailing of that product. But once a person sees that and you break down the process into chunks that they can understand, then people are more inspired to get involved and get into the industries.
Johan, just before I come to you, A.T. Kearney works across the globe, different cultures, different countries. How important is the question of culture?
Culture is one of those things that is difficult to grab. And I've never really seen a great definition either, to be frank, but we still know more or less, at least here, what it means, right? We talked about Korea just now, or I mentioned the example of Korea or Vietnam. Culture, certainly in the success story of those countries, played an absolute role. There's a very strong work ethic there that has been passed on from parents to children, and et cetera, et cetera. That culture has been there for a long time. And certainly where there's a stable environment that, that can grow and that has huge benefits for that, there is absolutely no reason that culture cannot be adapted in Africa as well in a successful way. It will take a time. It will take the right leadership. Government, I think, plays a crucial role. And again, Rwanda is a very good example, I think, of that. I also think the media plays a role, Nancy. Successful stories, I think you're absolutely right, of people that have done it and that are successful is crucial for people to see. And then to link that to the right vocational training. Because often when people are in their teenage years, that's when the big decisions are made in terms of career and what choices you make. Vocational training is infinitely more important than more white-collar jobs, certainly for Africa. And that is where I would love to see more focus on and more success stories on. And I think that will move.
So Jeffrey, as I come to you, I'll piggyback this question from Twitter. The gentleman did talk about education. Nancy Onyango on Twitter asks, are our certificates sufficient survival kits for young Africans in the fourth industrial revolution? Is our education producing or preparing citizens for what they can expect with the changes that are happening globally?
Well, for me, certificates, it's a bus ticket to get into the bus. So once you're in the bus, then you have to start learning and then getting exposure. I think what Ali said, sharing those success stories, that goes a long way. I think what we have not done well is to really showcase our successes. I think then coupled with that, then governments need to look at the policies in terms of ensuring that it's easier to do business. Because then if you have to go through lots of hoops, it actually discourages some of the people. And then it comes to the issue of access to financing. Financial institutions like ourselves but also the traditional banks should really look at being more accommodative for particularly the startups to say, how do we make it easier for them? Otherwise, if then people find it too onerous, then they would rather not get involved. So the certificate is okay, but it's a starting point. I don't think it...
Okay.
Yes.
But in terms of education,
yes.
Are those preparations that we make for people in school sufficient for the jobs of the future?
They're not necessarily sufficient. I think that's why Johan also talked about vocational employment training as well, because you need to supplement that. I mean, but we need also to accept that not everybody is going to be an entrepreneur, because some have to be entrepreneurs and some have to be actually employed. So it's really how do you strike that balance?
Okay. Let's take one more question as we wrap up our discussion. There's a gentleman in the middle here, if we could get a microphone to him. And then we'll come back to our panel just to sort of wrap it up with some very, very actionable points, things that are very tangible and realistic in terms of what we can do as we leave this room today.
Hello,
yes, sir, your question.
my name is El Hajba. I'm at the African Development Bank. So I just wanted to make a comment on culture. One day I was at the university and one Nobel Prize winner, Edward Prescott, walked in my office and asked me questions about Africa, what's going wrong and so on. So culture came up. I made the point, maybe the culture, because we like to spend on clothes instead saving and so on. He said, hold on there. 50 years ago, we Americans and Europeans, we were saying Asia cannot develop because of their culture. But today, we are saying their culture is the one. So, you need to be very careful. For him, people bring culture because they don't have other things. So if you take, the gentleman said, we don't have this idea of creating and so on. But you see on the side of the road, people making things. But you take like carpenters in Cote d'Ivoire. I often ask them, why can't you upskill? But they even don't have a place to work. They need to work on the side of the road. So it's the infrastructure and other services that they need for them to do well their business. And just another comment on trade. I think we talk often about free trade and trade policies and so on, but for me, we are missing about on this. It's not free trade we need, because often it is easier, for example, for us to import goods from China or Brazil. For example, we import chicken from Brazil in Africa than making that here. So we are not using strategic policy in trade. But if you look at Korea or China and so on, it's not free trade, it's strategic trade. So you need to know where you're going and use policies, design policies for that. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments, sir. And he makes a very important point. And I think one of the things that's been obvious in this discussion is, like you said, there's no silver bullet. There is no one solution that is going to radically transform Africa's production and manufacturing systems. However, we need to start somewhere. We need to start eating at that elephant. How do you do that? A little bit at a time. So what I'd like to hear from you now is, for each of you, what is that one thing that we can start at? Because yes, there's a lot to do, but if we were to pick just one thing that we could start at and galvanize our efforts, what would that thing be? I'll start with you, Jeffrey.
Well, we need to set targets. I find it sometimes helps if you set targets, then you can focus. I'll give you an example.
Haven't we done that?
No, I'll give you an example. Set targets and then you'll be able to implement, because then you set targets, you make them known, and then you implement. I'll give you an example. In South Africa on the renewable energy. So in the energy mix, there is targets to say how much percentage will come from renewable. And we've seen the last 3 years, the level of participation, the extent of cooperation, not only bringing in foreign direct investment, but also bringing in the commercial banks to participate. So what you're doing there, what we've seen is you're providing energy, but cleaner energy. And you're using what nature has given you, either wind or indeed sun in this instance. Now, what we need to do at the back of that is then how do we create industries, manufacturing industries. And I think if I look into the continent, there's lots of other countries which can also follow suit. So for me, tangible targets which you then implement.
So at the IDC, what is your tangible target?
Yes. For us, our tangible targets, we've set for the next 5 years, we need to invest over 100 billion rands, just about 100 billion rands in various sectors. So that's tangible for us, because then in that we're saying for that, we also want that 100 billion to be able to create just about 100,000 jobs. So that is tangible, that's going to focus us. And then you measure that periodically, because if you don't measure that, at least in our sense, then it's easier for you not to say, I've got those targets and that. But if you measure that, and then people can be able to be focused.
Thank you. Measurable targets. Ali, what's your one thing?
My one thing is really about making people believe that manufacturing is not this complicated animal. And I think we've got this myth in Africa that it's quite okay to be a micro business. It's quite okay to have somebody leave in the morning and sell something on the side of the road. It's quite okay to have somebody manufacturing something on the side of the road. But I think it's getting us to really genuinely believe that we can manufacture things ourselves and that it is really not complex. And I think once we overcome that, that we will see a lot more people that are going into businesses and manufacturing businesses for that matter, but being very deliberate about the fact that they want to grow big businesses and they want to expand their operations. So for me, that's the one. It's making people believe that it is doable.
Thank you, Ali. Johan.
Yeah, I knew you would get to me eventually. You mentioned at the beginning that we at A.T. Kearney has just launched together with the World Economic Forum a multi-year effort to look at the future of global production systems. And as you can imagine, it's a complex issue in Africa, but if the scope is the globe, it's even more so. Hence the reason for it being multi-year. Now, we are in the business of solving complex issues. That's what we do for a living, and of helping to transform countries and industries and companies. And so we will gladly provide our best resources for that, and we've made that commitment to do so. But this can only work, this effort, if everyone generously chips in. And I really mean that, generally chips in. That means that governments across Africa participate, that companies participate, stakeholders play their game. It requires everyone. It's a multi-stakeholder effort. So I really hope, and maybe this is an occasion to invite people to do that. I really hope that people will generally step up. Because what is the outcome of that? So if we would ask, what does success look like in a couple of years? Success is at least to two things. One is a more clear vision of what does it take to be successful in developing global production systems and, for instance, increase employment in that sector. What does it take? What are the elements of success? And number two is what are the best practices and what are the tools to make that happen? Very pragmatically, very practically, focused on whether an economy is emerging or already well developed, and focused on the different industry needs. So that effort has just been kicked off. We're looking forward to do it. We know it will require a lot of smart people and a lot of interested people to join, and we really hope that a lot of Africa will do that.
And I think that's a great note to end on. My panelists, thank you so much for your contributions today. I think it's been a very productive discussion, no pun intended, but key, I think, these takeouts that you've given us, talking about tangible targets, very important. We must know where we're going. Johan echoed you on that in terms of having a clear vision of what we want to see. And next year when we sit at the forum, hopefully we'll have some of those stories that we can talk about and say this began here. And also, Ali, what you said is very important as well. Believe in bigger. Africa needs to see itself manufacturing things. Africa needs to see itself as the leader of the fourth industrial revolution. If we could do it with M-Pesa, we could do it with anything else. And we need to be talking about more things besides just M-Pesa in terms of the journey that we're taking. Thank you so much for your time today. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for being such a wonderful audience. And I must apologize, we were supposed to have the Prime Minister of Ethiopia with us, but he was unfortunately unable to join us for the discussion. But we can continue the discussion online, on Twitter. Made in Africa is the hashtag. Enjoy the rest of your sessions. Thank you.